Welcome everyone to the Race to Zero webinar series, Uniting Asia to Combat Climate Change. This is the final session of our pre-COP26 webinar series. Earlier in the week, we talked about the country's unique opportunities and challenges to climate change, the roles of transport, energy, and cities in the built environment. This afternoon, we will talk about the role of nature-based solutions in addressing climate change. Before we begin, let me inform you that we will let all our speakers present first, and then we will have time for a Q&A session at the end. However, you can post any questions or comments you may have at any point during the session. We will have them addressed by our speakers during the Q&A. May we also request you to indicate the name of the speaker to whom you're addressing your questions to. To officially open our session for today, here's a message from Arup Manila's Managing Director, Mr. Raul Manlapig.
Nature-based solutions use the power of functioning ecosystems as infrastructure to provide services that benefit both the society and the environment. All nature-based solutions share three core elements. One, they work with and are based on natural systems. And two, they benefit nature directly. They can preserve or enhance biodiversity and ecosystem services. And three, they help address critical societal issues such as global climate change. As we envision a future that will see us living within planetary boundaries, nature-based solutions will be at the heart of design and our daily lives. With climate change, what we design needs to shift. We need to curate nature-based solutions and work with a wide range of other disciplines to complement and enhance traditional engineering approaches to infrastructure. Among others, we need to be up for the complex task of retrofitting existing buildings and developing infrastructure that are consistent with and enhance ecological landscapes while limiting greenhouse gas emissions. With the inevitable, pervasive, and highly contextual impacts of climate change, how we design also needs to shift. Designing for resilience and regeneration means a renewed focus on the collaborative processes, openness, diversity, adaptability, and consideration of place-based insight and lived experience. We likewise need to take an integrated approach, embrace the context of working within a natural system, harness the best technology, and balance this with stronger, fundamentally embedded social and cultural considerations. In the previous sessions in this webinar series, it has been repeatedly stressed that delays to climate action are no longer tenable. Ambitious and rapid responses are needed if we are to achieve global goals set forth in Paris and address climate change. Nature-based solutions are an integral response to this challenge. As engineers and sustainability practitioners, we need to do all we can to accelerate holistic, regenerative outcomes for people, places, and the planet. We should tune ourselves into nature, learn from it, and work with it. We cannot wait for another 50 years. With this, I welcome you to this session, and you will hear more from our speakers on what nature-based solutions are, their merits, how we can accelerate their deployment, and some local examples. I hope that you will all pick up a thing or two in the final session of this webinar series. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat.
Thank you, Mr. Manlapig. Now let's begin with our presentations. Our first speaker is a pioneering and multi-awarded scientist with more than 35 years of experience at the national and international level. He is the author of over 80 technical publications whose work primarily focuses on natural resources conservation, climate change, and land degradation. He is also an author of several reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 2007 co-winner of Nobel Peace Prize, as well as a member of the National Academy of Science and Technology in the Philippines. Currently, he is the executive director of the Oscar M. Lopez Center, a nonprofit foundation whose mission is to promote research on climate change and adaptation and resilience. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Rodel Lasco.
Good afternoon to all of you. And I am delighted to be part of this webinar. And I'm going to talk about nature-based solutions for climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. And as we are all aware, as also mentioned earlier by Raul, there's a lot of interest right now in nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions can work not just for climate change, of course, they can work also, or they are also applicable to other global environmental challenges, national and subnational environmental challenges. As you can see here, it's a bit a busy slide, but I just want to show here that from the mountains to the downstream areas, to wetland ecosystems, to cities, and all the way to coastal zones, nature-based solutions do have some application. And for my talk, I'll basically focus on climate change. And to start with, for example, we know that forests store vast amounts of carbon through the biomass, especially also in the soil. There's a huge storage of carbon, and growing forests continue to sequester carbon. And so when we cut trees, and especially when they are burned, CO2 is released to the atmosphere. And indeed, deforestation is one of the leading causes of greenhouse gas emissions right now. But on the flip side of that, if we have trees, if we plant trees, and of course care for them, then we increase carbon stocks through absorption and sequestration of carbon in the biomass, especially in the wood of trees, because about half or 50% of biomass is carbon by oven dry weight. And so it's a double-edged sword. When we cut trees, they emit carbon, but when we plant and protect and manage these forests well, they store and sequester carbon. And just to illustrate this point, here is the latest official greenhouse gas inventory for the Philippines with the year 2000 as kind of base year here. And you can see that energy, industrial processes, and others emit greenhouse gases. But in contrast, LUCF, or land use change, sequester more than 100 gigagrams per million tons of carbon. And so because of our forest lands and growing forests, the Philippines is able to offset a huge amount of its greenhouse gas emissions. And different forest types will have different ability to store carbon. Again, as an example here, based on our own research here, old growth or primary forest can sequester 160, even up to 200 plus tons of carbon per hectare, whereas secondary forest will have about half of that. And if you look at the grassland, which is on the rightmost bar, it's less than 20, maybe only 15 or 10 tons carbon per hectare. So just barely 10% of the original carbon storage. And so if we cut old growth forest and denude these forest areas, then we lose 90%, perhaps more, of the carbon. And so we've been looking at forest and climate change through our various work in the center. And just to summarize what I said earlier, just to summarize the adaptation and mitigation roles of forests, on the left side, the blue one, these are the adaptation or resilience building benefits from forest: more stable water flows, provision of goods and services, protecting biodiversity, and increasing income and livelihoods of especially smallholders in these forested areas. On the right side, you have the mitigation benefits, as mentioned earlier: carbon stocks, conservation, sequestration, and overall reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, trees and forests do help smallholder farmers in coping to climate hazards, primarily through crop and income diversification, soil and water conservation, and even a more efficient nutrient cycling and conservation of nutrients in the soil. And so not just benefits to nature, but at the same time to local communities as well. Now, the other example is for mangrove forests. And for mangroves, very similar to terrestrial forests, provision of goods and services, the biodiversity, income and livelihoods, and as well as carbon stocks and sequestration and reducing emissions. Now, to further illustrate this point, the World Bank conducted a study in the Philippines showing that if we lose all our mangrove forests, then there will be about a quarter more people who will be flooded, who would be exposed to flooding annually. That's more than 500,000 more people. And the damage will be up to $1 billion annually. Again, if we lose this mangrove forest. In other words, this is the protection benefits of these mangrove forests. 1 hectare, the study estimated, of mangroves do provide more than $3,000 of direct flood reduction benefits annually. And in terms of storm surges, these mangroves can attenuate or reduce surges in lower intensity storms and even high intensity. In a 25-year catastrophic events, these mangroves are able to prevent more than $1.6 billion of damages. And right after Haiyan or Yolanda, perhaps the strongest typhoon ever to hit land in the world, we conducted a study of mangrove areas and those people living in these mangroves. And we found out, based on their responses, almost 900 households we interviewed, and they reported that the wider or the larger the area of mangroves, those people living there reported less damage to their houses and infrastructure. The wider the mangroves, the same, but on the rightmost chart is the biodiversity of the mangrove. The correlation is not that clear. So again, this is just an example of a study we conducted to assess the benefits from natural ecosystems, in this case, mangroves. Before, we used to have 90% of our area covered with forest. That's it 100 years ago. But right now, we have about 20-25% forest cover left. So essentially, we lost 50% of our forest cover in the last 100 years. And so to address this massive loss of natural capital, the government is trying to address this to the National Greening Program, a very ambitious program to bring back these forests. The private sector is contributing as well. This is just an example being done by the Energy Development Corporation, a geothermal power corporation here in the Philippines. And finally, my last slide is just to remind ourselves that the current pandemic is related to all of these environmental changes. Change in the ecosystems and biodiversity could lead to the rise of epidemics, including what we're experiencing right now, COVID-19. And so to wrap this up, let me just conclude by saying that natural ecosystems are critical in enhancing the resilience of our people. And therefore, we must support efforts to conserve and manage wisely these natural resources. And so with this, I thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lasco, for sharing with us why natural ecosystems are very important in enhancing climate resilience. Let's now proceed with our second speaker. She is the Urban Climate Change Resilience Specialist with the ADB-administered Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund, or UCCRTF, which supports cities in 8 countries by improving urban planning, designing climate-resilient infrastructure, and investing in projects and people. She is involved in a diverse range of projects, including those on water supply and sanitation, flood forecasting and early warning system, coastal management, air quality improvement, post-disaster reconstruction, disaster risk financing, and other community-led projects. Join me in welcoming Ms. Joy Amor Bailey.
Thank you, Dr. Lasco, for your excellent presentation. It makes it easier for me to go on with my presentation. So again, I'm making this presentation on behalf of the Urban Climate Change Resilience Trust Fund. UCCRTF is administered by the Asian Development Bank. It consists of contributions coming from the Rockefeller Foundation, the United Kingdom, and also the Swiss government. Janella, just to check, can you see my slides?
Not yet, no.
How about this time? Apologies for that. May I request this tech support team to run my slides?
Hi, we can see it now. Thank you.
You can see it. Great. Thank you so much. So my presentation is about the application and deployment of nature-based solutions in the Philippines, the case of New Clark City. Some of you might have heard of the New Clark City and actually have seen the hosting of the Philippine government of the Southeast Asian Games back in 2019. So New Clark City is pegged as the country's solution to the overcrowded and overstressed Metro Manila. Let me first share with you a little bit on the context how ADB and the UCCRTF got involved. So this was at the request of the Philippines Bases Conversion and Development Authority. New Clark City is actually a former American military base. What is ADB's approach to nature-based solutions? So basically, it's a four-step process that takes a science-based, comprehensive and systematic approach to integrating NBS to ADB's business. And of course, we put forth the importance of using evidence such as climate risk and vulnerability assessments to inform the design of projects. So we started off with the assessment of ecosystem and its services. Next slide is about the Adb Resilience Framework, and then the development of nature-based solutions. We also have developed special tools like the GIS platform called SPADE for Spatial Decision-Making Support System. And then as a test case, we have the New Clark City and integrating these recommendations and solutions into the project design. At the moment, we're also in close cooperation with the UK's Global Future Cities program for integrating these nature-based solutions. So setting the context for the NBS is actually also anchored on ADB's Resilience Framework. So this has four core pillars: ecological resilience, infrastructure, financial, social, and institutional. So what we mean is that when we want to come up with holistic solutions, we should look at different angles and not just focus on physical assets per se, or just government or social issues per se. So we want a combination of multiple solutions. And we also wanted to communicate that when we look at gray and green infrastructure, we must not give the impression that engineering measures and nature-based solutions are separate. So these are actually could be complementary. So New Clark City is about more than 100 kilometers north of Manila. This is a metropolis that's also planned around 9,450 hectares. Of that, only more than 3,000 hectares will be developed. And the projected population is 1.2 million. So its physical development plan has been prepared for 40 years or so. There are expected about 800,000 workers. New Clark City has so many features. It will have government facilities. It will also have a special economic zone, mixed housing, as well as recreational areas. So the opportunity for nature-based solutions is actually very high. And this is where the support of UCCRTF comes in. A few years back, the ADB's Office of Public-Private Partnerships was invited by the BCDA to support the transaction advisory services. And OPPP then sought the support and volunteered the UCCRTF to review the master plan and offer from a climate change perspective and also sustainable development perspective, how can we make New Clark City green and resilient? What you can see on your screen is the original master plan. So you can see from here that actually it's a grid layout. For the urban planners, you might have seen this also in existing cities that the grid is very prominent and it does offer certain advantages. However, you can also see on the screen that for the river, they're going to heavily channelize it. And then it will be confined within that grid. And therefore, there are also risks involved when you do that kind of solutions. So when we offer the recommendations on the review of the master plan, which was requested by the BCDA, we informed them that there are adverse impacts on pursuing that kind of grid layout. It could accelerate the discharge of flood water downstream, increasing flood risk to towns below. And of course, it reduces the natural capacity of the river floodplain to detain flood and recharge the aquifer. There are also high infrastructure cost of embankments and bridges. Also, in terms of placemaking, we saw that the river is a very nice feature of New Clark City, and it should be a highlight of that area rather than cover it in concrete. So the master plan review recommended an alternative nature-based solution. What was also timely was that the Philippine government was at that time tendering the first phase of New Clark City. This is for the National Government Center, which also included the sports facilities. So the recommendations included taking advantage of the river's natural capacity to retain floods. So make room for the river. And then NPS solution would reduce construction cost as well. That's how we also try to put forth the incentives of using nature-based solutions and create space to develop a green zone and establish New Clark City's branding as a green city. So we don't want New Clark City to look like a typical metropolis in Southeast Asia that's just full of concrete buildings, high tower buildings. And also we wanted to ensure that there's future groundwater supply, given that there are really long-term plans for this development. Again, where we were dealing with a government agency that's also working with a lot of partners, including the private sector. So we also had to convince them that by using nature-based solutions, from an economic point of view, you also have reduced cost of bridges, for example. And then you reduced also the cost of cutting trees, etc. So what you can actually see there if you visit New Clark City is that for the phase 1, they've diverted from the original plan of making it a grid. So they've adopted a nature-positive approach to keep the natural river minder. As you can see also, the gabions will also allow for flood water to be contained and go down in the river. The green zone also developed along the riverbank is now in place. If you visit, this is also where the workers there enjoy their break time. And of course, it's very good for biodiversity. So what you can also see from the photo is that there's now a better interaction between nature and between the visitor or the people who are in New Clark City. At the moment, another technical assistance, this time implemented by the UK's Future Cities program, is also helping the BCDA come up with a design for its central park. So the central park is also among the recommendations that came up in the UCC-RTF's master plan review. With the preservation of the river, this will also be linked to a 45-hectare central park. So at one of the river sections to complement the riverbank green zone. So these are now under discussions on the features of the park and also how to make it sustainable. So this park is going to form part of a primary network of interconnected city canals and river channels that will create a natural green-blue grid across the city. Now, the very nice photos you see on the screen are actually taken from New Clark City. Back in 2019, ADB's Environment Thematic Group conducted a biodiversity assessment. Many of these experts also involved those from the University of the Philippines in Los Baños. Interestingly, let me round down some of this very nice information. What they found in the assessment, there were 156 native plant species, including 71 exotic species. And then there are 29 threatened species, like the Molabe tree. With terrestrial wildlife, they found 106, so quite a high number, including those endemic to the area, such as the marble-crested lizard, the Philippine cobra, and then the Philippine warty pig. And then there are also 12 species of fishes that were collected during the sampling. So this information is also being used to support the design of the park. And then they also want to make it sustainable, and they wanted to make it to have the community more involved. So there are also going to be nurseries, tree nurseries that will be put in place. DCDA is also looking forward to design a sustainability team within the office, which is also among the recommendations that UCCRTF and UKFCDO suggested to them. So let me quickly go through some of the slides with my remaining time. So the economics of green infrastructure. So we believe that it can be cost effective, because sometimes there's a misconception that maybe it's more expensive if you do nature-based solutions. As well as we wanted to promote it with offering multiple benefits, including monetary and non-market benefits. So for the monetary, for example, the land value capture, you can probably imagine that the buildings closest to the park, or those looking at the park, are probably going to be more expensive. As I think what's happening in New York, where those looking at the Central Park are the prime spots. Of course, it must also address both economic case and financial case. So nature-based solutions also require operations and maintenance costs, and that must not be forgotten. And then there are also forms of savings and reduced cost from future damages. For example, how the nature-based solutions offer flood risk reduction, or how it protects biodiversity, or how it offers recreation areas for people. So this one is just to reiterate what I mentioned earlier. There are also some advantages, for example, the relative ease of NBS reversibility compared to traditional engineering solutions. Because again, it's not heavy on the concrete side. It also empowers communities to be involved. So from the beginning of designing it all the way to implementing it and maintaining it. So let me also close my presentation with some of the reflections we have so far. So among the challenges are NBS cost estimation of methods are not standardized. For example, land value capture, it's a difficult economic and financial analysis. There are also lacking standards for evaluating performance of NBS. And then there's a concern over the complexity and longer project preparation times. For example, when you design nature-based solutions, we must ensure that it's really linked to the overall master plan. And again, there's also sometimes a misconception that NBS is more suited to public goods, because most people assume that, when you do NBS, these are, non-income generating projects. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to your questions at the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bailey, for sharing with us ADB UCC RTF's experience and approach to integrating nature-based solutions in New Clark City. So allow me to introduce to you our third speaker, who is the Director for Natural Climate Solutions, or NCS, at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He works with companies to integrate natural climate solutions into net zero strategies and increase investment in NCS for climate mitigation and adaptation outcomes. He also leads the Secretariat of the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, a multi-stakeholder coalition of over 45 organizations sharing a vision to enable natural climate solutions to contribute their full potential towards the Paris climate goals, as well as help solve some of the world's most pressing and intractable environmental and social challenges. The Alliance develops guidance for companies on how to invest in high-quality NCS with integrity, and on scaling up private sector investment in NCS through a demand signal campaign. Prior to joining the World Business Council, he has worked for Myrova Natural Capital, investing in diverse nature-based solution projects, building upon experience developing avoided deforestation and forest restoration projects for Fauna and Flora International. From these experiences, he has developed a robust understanding of nature-based solutions, project implementation, and the voluntary carbon markets. Let us all welcome Dr. James Smith.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Janella, and it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you all here this afternoon. So yes, I'm Dr. James Smith, Director of Natural Climate Solutions at Wbcsd. For those of you who don't know Wbcsd, it's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and it's a CEO-led organization of 200 of the most forward-thinking companies which are looking to implement the transformational changes that we need to see in our society if we're to reach a position of 9 billion people living within planetary boundaries and healthily by 2050. So, I'm really pleased to speak to you today. Obviously, the title of this series is the Race to Zero, and so and with COP high on the agenda, kicking off in 2 weeks in Glasgow, I'm really going to speak about the opportunities that we have to scale up investment for nature-based solutions, and specifically nature-based solutions for climate, through corporate climate commitments and the voluntary carbon markets. So I'll start then with the first slide, and I wanted to really start with this one here and to highlight that, whilst we are in the midst of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, and this has had huge impacts on our life, on our personal lives, on the way that we work, and our health and social systems, we also need to put this into a bit of context. And whilst this is a short, a very sharp impact on our societies, there are potentially larger issues at play here, as have already been highlighted by Dr. Lasco. And obviously, with the current pace of change in limiting climate change, we're on target for, I think it's over 3 degrees C of warming. And that's going to have a huge impact on our societies. It's going to cause increased severity and increased impact of extreme weather events such as droughts, cyclones, flooding, etc. And will cause a whole host of other issues that will really deeply affect our societies. And these will be long-term impacts. So this is a major challenge. But what I really like about this slide here, and I know it's maybe odd to start with a cartoon, is to show that actually the fourth wave here, biodiversity collapse, is actually bigger than the climate change collapse. And this is an issue which I don't think we as a society have properly come to terms with yet. The loss of nature and the rate of change is really staggering, and this will have implications for life as we know it in a similar manner to climate change. So for some statistics, of course, since human civilization started, we've lost half of our forests. We've lost I think it's probably over half of our coral reefs as well. And extinction rates are 100 to 1,000 times higher than they are naturally. But why is this important? Well, this is really important because climate change and biodiversity loss are linked. As Dr. Lasco mentioned, natural ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon, and as they're lost, we then release more carbon into the atmosphere. That makes climate change worse. Climate change affects the ability of species to live in the habitats they do now, and therefore that drives further biodiversity loss. So it's a very dangerous cycle. But importantly, in terms of when we think about what business can do, it's important for us to also consider the benefits that we as society generate from nature. Now, this nature provides us with a whole host of benefits that we totally take or have taken for advantage. These are flows of goods and services called ecosystem services, such as you can see in the graphic here, provides us with nutrient cycling, helps generate healthy and productive soils, provision of food, natural fibers, fresh water, flood regulation, climate regulation, provides us with places where we can play sport and enjoy. So a lot of these goods that we value have never properly been costed. They've never been really valued, as Joy mentioned. And as they're common goods that we take, for example, they don't have a cost in our traditional kind of financial decision-making processes. And this is really dangerous because these intangible products that we all benefit from, as we don't recognize them with an economic value, we don't then bring them into our decision-making processes, and then they get excluded. And that's what's led to this situation where we're destroying over time our natural capital. Now, that's rather dangerous when we think about the impacts to business, because obviously all businesses are fundamentally dependent on nature and all of these goods and services that I've described. And if we, some recent reports from Swiss Re highlighted that over half of global GDP is dependent on healthy, functioning ecosystems, and these are being lost at a terrific rate. So, and we see that business is starting to recognize that. This slide just highlights that in the business survey of key business risks from CEOs, the global risk landscape has rapidly changed, and corporates are now starting to recognize the impact of biodiversity and climate risk in 2020, 2021, compared to 2010, where it's all about changes in asset price, recession, all of these issues. That's a very healthy start, but there's certainly more that needs to come. Now, although we have such dependence on nature, we're in a not such a great position when it comes to recognizing that and actually providing finance to support the nature and to restore and conserve it. There is a financing gap of over 4 trillion over the next 3 decades. And that's 4 times the amount of current investment that is going into nature. So we must develop mechanisms whereby we can channel investment into nature for the benefit of us all. Investment in nature is far less than investment in climate currently. And we need to rapidly turn this around, recognize the value of nature to society, to business, and find ways of financing this. Now, as has already been highlighted, nature-based solutions or nature-based solutions for climate, or another acronym that's often used is natural climate solutions. These are a really important way in which we could turn this tide and channel financing towards nature-based solutions. So natural climate solutions are activities that they either protect, they conserve, or they restore natural or managed ecosystems to generate emissions reductions or to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And there's an example here on this slide of some of those activities. So we've already heard about the importance of reforestation, the importance of avoiding deforestation, the importance of avoiding mangrove loss. But there are other activities which can provide substantial climate benefits, including planting trees and croplands, we call agroforestry, and improving agricultural practices to build up soil carbon stocks, etc. Now, that's great, but the question then comes, what's the role of business in investing in these activities that will provide these benefits to society? Now, some fantastic research that was done 3 or 4 years ago highlighted that natural climate solutions, such as those activities I just shared, could provide about 1/3 of the climate mitigation that is needed by 2030. And that's to meet our Paris Agreement goals that were set at the COP in Paris in 2015. Importantly, these activities can be done at scale. We are already managing landscapes. We know what these activities are, how to implement them. They can be low cost compared to technological solutions. And as they're available at scale and low cost, they can be rolled out much quicker than some of the solutions, technological solutions, which are still kind of in a pilot phase. And importantly, as has already been highlighted, by restoring and conserving nature, we can provide all kinds of other benefits for society, as highlighted on my previous slide. So, this is a webinar about the race to zero. And if we're talking about race to zero, we're talking about how are we as a society going to get to net zero? And part of that question then is what's the role and what's the pathway for companies to reach a position of net zero? So for those that are, I'm sure everyone on the call is very familiar, but the idea, of course, of net zero is that companies should aggressively reduce their carbon emissions over the next 2 to 3 decades to the point at which they can't reduce those emissions any further. That's shown by these blue lines on the graph here on the right. At the point at which emissions can't be reduced any further, they should then invest in activities that remove emissions from the atmosphere to balance those remaining emissions. Those are in the purple here. And then, of course, companies also have the opportunity, as they move towards a position of net zero, of also balancing their current emissions with avoided emissions from other activities. And so this is kind of the trajectory for companies that wish to reach net zero. Importantly, natural climate solutions can contribute to all of these elements of a corporate climate strategy, both the shorter term emissions reductions and then the removals that companies will need to invest in as they reach net zero. So on the next slide, I'm going to run through how companies could incorporate natural climate solutions or nature-based solutions for climate into their strategy. So if we think about the emissions reductions that companies need to make, an important sector when we think about these is the agriculture, food, and land use sector, what we call the AFLU sector. Now, I'm sure people are aware on this call that the land use and the management of land is the sector which contributes the second largest amount of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. It's around about a quarter of global emissions. So if we change these management practices, we can drastically reduce emissions and limit climate change. So that means that companies in this food and, in the land sector, so food and beverage producers, consumer goods companies, forestry companies, etc., could implement and invest in activities such as improved agricultural management. So changing how they manage the soil, cover cropping, not tilling the soil, changing the fertilizers they use, etc., to reduce emissions. They also can invest in reducing deforestation and improving the management of natural forests. And all of these will help reduce emissions. As companies go through that process then, and they move towards net zero, there's an opportunity to purchase, to balance their remaining emissions by investing in removals from other activities. So that could involve planting trees in croplands, it can involve reforestation, it could involve other activities such as restoring coastal wetlands. And as highlighted, if companies want to go carbon neutral on the way and they want to be, to have the most climate ambition in the near term, then of course they can optionally compensate for their emissions by purchasing carbon credits from the voluntary carbon markets to match the emissions above the line with an equal number of emissions reductions. And that's an opportunity to finance avoided deforestation, the conservation and improved management of wetlands, etc. So that's kind of a high level overview of the importance of NCS, nature-based solutions for climate, and also how companies can integrate these into their net zero pathways. Importantly, the voluntary carbon markets provide an important mechanism by which companies can do so, and also meet their net zero targets. So I know I'm probably over time, so I'm going to skip this slide and just highlight that at Wbcsd, we work very heavily in these markets to help scale these markets and provide all stakeholders with the trust they need to ensure that these solutions reach their full potential. So for instance, at the moment, we are working with organizations to help define and provide clarity to business on what net zero is and the claims that companies can make. We're providing and developing case studies on what good looks like, what high quality natural climate solutions projects look like on the ground that generate verified impacts. And we're also developing a campaign where companies commit to purchasing NCS as part of their corporate climate strategies to drive this momentum to invest, to channel private sector investment in NCS. So with that, I'm going to stop. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, for sharing with us how to scale up investment in NCS and how companies can incorporate natural climate solutions. Thank you. Moving forward, we're down to our final speaker. He is a director of Arup who has over 30 years of experience in the field of project management, site formation, ground and project risks, underground space, geotechnical design, engineering geology, and tunneling related work. He has carried out complex project management on various infrastructure projects, from large-scale MTR and Hong Kong government projects, major ADB infrastructure projects, to smaller local private and regional scale projects and studies. He has led teams of specialists in civil engineering, tunneling, engineering geology, and a lot more for the majority of the specialists' input on deliverables in Hong Kong, Philippines, South Korea, Vietnam, Australia, Singapore, and other East Asia locations. He has led and developed the tunneling and engineering geology teams in the Hong Kong office and currently provides overall guidance and support to the teams for various tunneling and engineering geology related input. He is also the current president of the Philippine Tunneling Society. May we call on Mr. Mark Wallace.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Wallace, a director in Arup, and I'm the infrastructure leader in the Philippines. But I served a lot of my time with Arup in Hong Kong, and my presentation today will try to highlight some nature-based solutions that can be considered in hazard mitigation, specifically flood risk and landslide management. So what are the nature-based solutions definitions? This is one put forward by the European Commission, where they are solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective and provide environmental, social, economic, and most importantly, build resilience for local communities. So nature-based solutions are our way to integrate between green infrastructure in our environment and the natural capital that we have in our planetary resources. They allow us to observe and use the natural living processes to help restore the balance to improve our natural capital. So how should we put nature-based solutions into context with our natural environment? Here we can see some of the natural dynamic processes that were around before man arrived on the scene. Deltas, meandering river systems, fast-flowing river systems, floodplains, deserts, sand dunes, coastlines, marine environments. And humans have tried to tame and control them as we have altered the ecosystems and changed the land and the processes to fit our way of living and our urbanized landscapes. We've occupied our coastlines to gain access to the sea, sometimes in a chaotic manner through reclamation and losing that coastal habitat and natural barrier to the sea. We've tried to control the sediment movement along our coastlines, and sometimes while protecting some areas, have misunderstood the natural processes and caused more problems with erosion and coastal cliff collapse, as can be seen in the photograph on the right. In many parts of the world, over the ages, humans have been reinforcing and building up riverbanks to stop flooding. And now some rivers in China are over 30 meters above the surrounding floodplains. They can no longer meander freely as they used to, and we need to understand how to manage and control river surges and flooding through our cities and urban areas. So the challenge is to move away from the hard human-based solutions and go back to nature and adopt the middle ground solutions of human-assisted natural processes and natural engineering. Nature-based solutions are being increasingly incorporated into our urban landscapes to put back what we have taken away and to use nature to provide a more resilient and diverse ecological framework. Concepts of sponge cities that actively work with nature to understand surface water runoff, infiltration and flood, with human engineered support, is increasingly being adopted in our urban areas and environment. So water management and flood control is one area that nature-based solutions can be considered. Here is an example that Arup has implemented in China. This is one from Nanjing, where the need was to improve low flow water quality and to have areas available to control flood surges and control the water flow through the city. Wetland areas were created and expanded to store and allow the river flow and improve the ecosystems and the biodiversity, while adding societal improvement and tourism to the area. This is another project, a proposed development in Nanjing, where the sponge city concept for flood management with ground infiltration was an active part of the design. There was internal catchments and natural swales and wetland areas incorporated to store flood and to protect the development from seasonal variations in water level from nearby rivers and streams. This is an example from Italy. It's not an Arup project, but the problem that they had with the flooding and siltation were mostly solved by putting back the river to its natural width and not trying to tame it as it was before. In the Philippines, there are many organizations like the Forest Foundation of the Philippines actively restoring mangrove areas to improve biodiversity, restore ecosystems, reduce storm surge impacts, and flooding to local coastal communities. Another hazard that can have nature-based solutions applied is landslide management and deforestation, promoting and creating the unstable landslides on the hills. So in Hong Kong, the Kadoorie Farm organization has been actively managing some of the hillsides near their facilities to improve ecosystems and biodiversity, but also to reduce the risk of landslides affecting their properties. They have been using native species to restore and help the hillsides recover and re-establish themselves. In other areas of Hong Kong, there are frequent landslides, and over the years it has impacted and killed many people, unfortunately. But it denudes the terrain, causes erosion, and fills the rivers with sediment, further exacerbating downstream flooding. In this photograph here, you can see me for scale when I was inspecting landslides in Hong Kong. So in the past, it was the Hong Kong government's response to install hard engineering slope stabilization measures such as soil nailing, boulder fences, debris flow check dams and basins, and so on. This is still done on a hazard and risk-based approach, but there was a feeling that there should be another solution available to help improve hillside stability. So in 2008, the Geotechnical Engineer Office in Hong Kong recognized that bioengineering solutions could be applied to landslide and unstable hillside management rather than the hard engineering solutions such as soil nails, etc. In Geo Report 227, there's a flow chart that outlines the selection process on when to consider bioengineering as a potential solution for landslide and erosion management. It's quite a useful chart to follow. So you can download this from the CED website in Hong Kong. So in bioengineering, there are really three overriding principles, such as ground strengthening, where branches and roots are needed to permeate into the ground to improve the surface soil strength, erosion control, where the surface soils are protected from fast water runoff and rainfall impacts. And the last but most important is to control and enhance the surface drainage flow off a slope, all incorporating a range of live and biodegradable materials. When we're considering ground strengthening, it is to try and stop local slumping and instability of the near surface soils by adding branches and live fascines to quickly penetrate the ground by adding root growth into the soil to bind it together. By combining the techniques in an interlaced series of root strengthening measures, it really binds the soil together. The regular spacing also provides a barrier to surface water runoff and slows the surface water down when it runs off the slope. Other techniques that can be used are short-term physical strengthening with buried wood frames in the ground supplemented with live branches to provide the longer-term binding effect, such as here with the crib walls. The buried wood decays over time, but the roots then establish a more binding effect through the whole soil mass. Here you can see the difference in a couple of years for this example. Another technique commonly established on steeper ground is to build rows of live branch fencing with coconut fibers or hessian matting that can be staked down with live branches. This is designed to reduce the speed of surface water runoff, catch the local soil erosion, and allow the vegetation to establish and bind it together. Drainage management is very important And here there are various solutions shown where the water runoff is controlled with live branch stake channels with either rock rubble or local channels to divert runoff from the slope. Again, over time, the roots establish and bind the drainage line together. Erosion control mats are common in many parts of Hong Kong and the Philippines, but it should be supplemented with hydroseeding to more quickly establish a vegetation cover on those Hessian mats or those flower mats. But this should be done close to the start of the wet season to allow the vegetation to become established. So in terms of species selection, it's important to consider the types of vegetation that can be used and what benefit that it has in terms of root growth and whether it can be used for live branches, hedges, and other bioengineering solutions. This table is for typical Hong Kong native species, but similar charts should be used for Philippines and other places in the region. It's usual to do surveys or carry out surveys of the nearby trees and vegetation near the proposed bioengineering measures to harvest from local native vegetation for the bioengineering measures. Normal pruning and cutting to use in nurseries is also carried out to establish the materials to use in the bioengineering works. A very important aspect of these techniques is to ensure that the vegetation survives the dry season and becomes established. So watering is important in the early years of the bioengineering solutions. Hong Kong has set up solar-powered irrigation systems to ensure that the vegetation can become well established to survive the seasonal changes in rainfall. And you only need to do that usually for the first couple of years. In the Philippines, there has been various examples of hillside restoration to improve soil stability, reduce runoff, and downstream flooding. This example from Biliran has also incorporated establishing cash crops for the local people to provide a more sustainable solution and some earning potential in terms of gathering those crops. Indeed, using these native species is very important to ensure that sustained and managed forests are re-established over areas where the vegetation has been stripped by slash and burn techniques commonly practiced in the Philippines. At one time, Philippines held the world record for reforestation planting with more than 3.2 million trees planted in 1 hour. Another example is here from Kayanga Solar Farm project that we are working with Wbcsd in Pangasinan, where we're constructing the solar farm on hilly terrain, and there's a need to improve the stability of some of the areas of the ground for landsliding and soil erosion. So bioengineering is being considered to restore those areas of soil erosion and to improve the overall hillside stability to protect the hillsides and reduce the runoff into lower catchments. So Wbcsd Power is working with DNR to also do adjacent areas hillside restoration, so we restore the forests that were taken away. And also to reduce the runoff and reduce the amount of landslides that are occurring and the downstream flood risks for local communities. By doing this, we can improve the stored carbon on the hillsides from about 10 to 30 tons of carbon per hectare for grassland and scrubland areas up to secondary forests at around 200 tons per hectare. And this will equate to well over 1 million trees to be re-established and should create employment and future resources for sustainable management of the forest for over the next 20 to 30 years. So hopefully I provided some examples of how nature-based solutions can help in preventing hazards and re-establishing the natural ecosystems and improve both urban and mountain areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and expertise and giving us some good examples, some examples of your projects in integrating nature-based solutions. So that concludes the highly informative presentations from our speakers. Thank you very much. So I know you agree with me that each topic is very timely and relevant, especially, of course, in our country, the Philippines, considering we are one of the most vulnerable nations to climate crisis. So while we're preparing for the Q&A, It also shows that you're all working together in exploring solutions to reach our goal for net zero. So maybe call on again our speakers for our Q&A session. Let's start with the first question. This question came from our audience. It's for Ms. Joy Bailey. Ms. Joy, the question is, in formulating or planning of natural-based solutions in a city, do we have a primary focus, meaning there are a lot of aspects to be considered? Is it recommended to have nature-based solutions rolled out first on water-related problems or social aspects or wildlife? Can you share what a roadmap could look like for nature-based solutions in cities?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and actually, it's very hard to give a very short response. I think what's important is from the very beginning to make the process inclusive. When we put in nature-based solutions, you have different purposes, and you're also catering to different customers or clients, be it the community or the private sector or the government agency. And I think it's always important to look at what are your resilience principles. Otherwise, it would be difficult to connect what's being planned for the nature-based solutions if there's going to be, if it's not linked to your overall master plan. So again, please free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to share with you the New Clark study, specifically the river study and also our study on resilient water supply for New Clark City.
Thank you, Ms. Joy. I think they have another question for that on New Clark City. So the question is, the New Clark City is a great example of what synergies between green and gray infrastructure can look like. How easy or difficult is it to scale such initiatives in the country?
Actually, the context is a little bit different in the case of New Clark City. Most of our cities in the Philippines have evolved through the years. The opportunity in New Clark City is because it's greenfield. You have to start from scratch. With the work in New Clark City, what was also very excellent was this cooperation with BCDA, who looks at international best practices and actually has learned also based on their experiences in managing other properties like the BGC. So for example, they realize, we really need more spaces for public parks. We need to put in more recreational areas, put in arts and so on, and also have this other social amenities. So again, the challenge there and the opportunities are always present.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Joy, for enlightening our audience on that. The next question would be for Dr. Rodel Lasco. Dr. Rodel, the Manila Bay cleanup is part of DENR's top 10 priority programs. As a scientist, what are your thoughts or insights in the recent efforts of the government for Manila Bay, which sparked controversies in the country?
Well, there are many efforts right now in Manila Bay. I'm not sure if the question is about the sort of master planning that I think was just completed for Manila Bay. There was that huge project there. And I personally think that such a sort of master planning is appropriate because of the many factors responsible for what's happening right now in the Manila Bay area. The controversy perhaps is is probably the beach or dolomite project. And some of our scientists based at the University of the Philippines, commented on the project and whether it's appropriate or not. I'm not a marine scientist myself, but I think there are Filipino scientists who have expressed reservations in such a project. So I'll probably leave it at that. But I agree that there's a need to do an integrated and holistic planning if we are to address the challenges of the Manila Bay area. Janella, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Lasco, for sharing your expert opinion on that topic. Another question for you is, you've shown the importance of keeping old growth forests and mangrove stands intact to mitigate and adapt to climate change. but we have been losing our forests and ecosystems at an accelerating rate in the Philippines. Can you share your insights on what policies and strategies are needed to reverse this trend and to promote NBS as an integral climate solution?
Okay, again, it's such a huge issue. But first, let me say that it's not at least based on official statistics and perhaps even satellite remote sensing. Our forests are stabilizing. Our forest area, I mean, is stabilizing, perhaps increasing a bit. And that's probably because we have lost so much. So there's no way but up. And also perhaps government policies and programs are getting traction. And so what to do? Of course, we're not satisfied. We're down to 25 forest cover, and we need much more. We still have 10 million hectares out of 30 million that need restoration and reforestation. What's the solution? There are so many possible solutions. The law is still in our legislature waiting to be enacted. This is the Sustainable Forest Management or Forest Management Act. Other than that, we also need to incentivize stakeholders that is on the ground at the grassroots level, whether local communities, indigenous peoples. They must have a stake in restoring forests and keeping areas under forest cover. So there's so many things we can do. Well, I guess it's improving by not by leaps and bounds, but at least slowly. I can see some improvement in our forest management in the country. Back to you, Janela.
Yeah, and I agree with that, Dr. Lasco. I know there are a lot of efforts by the government, like the National Greening Program. It's continuous. Okay, let's proceed with a question from the audience for Dr. James Smith. Dr. James, the question is, if most of the co-benefits of natural climate solutions are not sold in markets and are typically public goods, how do we address the massive financing gap? And how do we convince the private sector to also invest in these solutions, particularly if the revenue streams and profitability are not as clear as a typical green energy project?
Thanks for that question. It's a really good one, absolutely. So my first thoughts on that are that, as Dr. Rodel Lasco mentioned and Mark mentioned, of course, a nature-based solution by definition should deliver not only for nature impact, but also deliver services that are beneficial to the societal challenges that we face. And that includes climate change, and it includes the massive inequity crisis that we have. And so the majority of nature-based solutions projects should deliver co-benefits addressing all of these needs and should address the Sustainable Development Goals and provide other community benefits. Now, in terms of how we can finance these types of actions, as I highlighted during my talk, a lot of our work focuses on the carbon markets because companies recognize the value of carbon and its impact on climate change, and therefore we've been able to put a price on this ecosystem service. Now, by investing in avoiding emissions or sequestering carbon from the atmosphere through nature-based solutions, very typically, although the mechanism is, or the financial driver is for the carbon, these do deliver benefits for people. So for instance, if we think about changing agricultural practices, if you invest in agroforestry systems, so you plant trees through other cropping systems, you can provide numerous co-benefits for local farmers and communities by, if you're very careful about the trees that you select and that you place into these systems. If these are timber trees or these are fruit trees, then they can provide additional crops and products that these farmers can sell, and then that can improve their income, improve their and their well-being. But in addition, can provide a whole host of other impacts that are beneficial to the general community over the long term. So very often, such interventions will also improve soil fertility. They will improve the microclimate of the crops underneath. This will make sure that they're more resilient to climate impacts such as drought etc., etc. And by providing a habitat for biodiversity can also improve yields by increasing pollination services, increasing pest reduction services as more mammals and birds will be able to forage in that land. And so that can provide additional benefits by increasing yields and making those yields more stable over time. So although carbon from a lot of our work focuses on carbon, that's the primary and probably the largest global market that we have to invest in nature-based solutions. Typically, these activities also provide substantial benefits for communities also across the board and across the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Dr. James, for that knowledgeable response to our question from the audience. We have a question for Mr. Mark Wallace. Mr. Wallace, can you compare the relative cost and ease of implementing bioengineering interventions vis-a-vis hard engineering solutions?
Yes, thanks, Nia. Yeah, typically these sort of measures are put in place, and the comparisons are somewhere in the region of a third of half the price of a normal hard engineering solutions. So, but the benefits go beyond just that. Actually, there's a whole range of other benefits that you get out of doing the bioengineering solutions, such as the biodiversity, bringing back nature into those areas. And so while, it is typically cheaper, you will get a better outcome with using the bioengineering solutions, but you have to basically look after it more, and the maintenance of that actually has some additional costs actually than over the hard engineering solutions. One thing I'd also like to say about that is about the codes and standards that we've all grown up with. Actually, the codes and standards that we apply to our built environments have all been based upon the sort of us changing and taming our environment to fit what we have done in the past. And it's rare that you actually find codes and standards that are actually properly implemented for a bioengineering or a nature-based solution. So we should actually focus at trying to change our codes and specifications to fit that actually, because quite often they're not available and they're not commonly implemented by companies and governments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Mark. I see we're still getting a lot of questions from the audience, but unfortunately, we have ran out of time already. So with this, join me in thanking Dr. Lasco, Dr. Smith, Ms. Bailey, and Mr. Wallace for generously sharing their time and expertise on the importance of nature-based solutions in our fight to combat climate change.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
All right. Allow me to finally thank the following supporting to help make this Manila leg of our COP26 webinar series possible. Thank you to the British Embassy, Philippine Green Building Council, Puno Law, Green Energy Solutions Incorporated, Clean Air Asia, National Center for Transport Studies, ADEA, Green Architecture of the Philippines, United Architect of the Philippines, Oscar M. Lopez Center, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Again, thank you everyone. Have a good afternoon and stay safe.